Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third workshop in our current series, Policing in a Time of Pandemic. My name is Karen Duckworth, and it's my pleasure to welcome our presenter today and tomorrow for the workshop titled A Policing Response to Harmful Practices. We're very lucky to have Polly Harrar, the CEO of the Harrar project, to share her insight and experience in this field. You may be interested to know actually that Polly's currently featured in the online policing journal Policing Insight in relation to this workshop today and tomorrow, and we'll be sharing the links to that after the session today. Just a small housekeeping note in relation to questions and chat. Because there's quite a lot to get through today and tomorrow. So in terms of managing questions, if you have anything to add, please comment, question through the chat, and then we can reflect that back to Polly at an appropriate time during the presentation. So without further ado, thank you very much. Polly, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you again, Karen, and for everyone for joining us this morning. As you just bear with me a moment while I get my slides. Excellent. So as you'll be aware, today's session is around the policing response to harmful practices. And so we've got an awful lot to cover, so we will go through the slides. And as Karen has mentioned, we welcome any of your questions in the chat. So just starting off a little bit about myself. So as well as being the CEO of the Harrar project, I'm the joint chair of the Metropolitan Police's London Harmful Practice Working Group. And for the last 20 years, I've dedicated my time towards safeguarding, but also raising awareness through training to ensure professionals have the skills and the ability and the knowledge to be able to provide appropriate support around safeguarding for those affected by harmful practices. So today we're going to be looking at the key concepts of harmful practices. This is quite often a difficult topic to address when it comes to policing. So what we want to do today is explore some of those crime types and look at the evidence base around the need for further policing. So when we look at harmful practices, the first thing we need to note is that we need to look at this from a gendered lens. Why? Because quite often it is the female who is abused, and the perpetrator is quite often a male. Now, this isn't exclusive. We do recognise that men can be victims of some harmful practices, but quite often it's a gendered issue. So this session is going to be looking at harmful practices from a female perspective. You can see on the slides that the information to further evidence this, not just from a UK perspective, but also from an international lens as well. So before we carry on, I wanted to start with a quick poll. This is very much a what do we know? So you will see in the box there's a poll, and it should come up with a brief question around where is the most unsafe place for a woman. So we're just going to spend a few moments just to go through that poll, and I believe it should be on there right now. So just looking at the figures here, I can see there's a bit of a mixed views as to the most dangerous place, be it a nightclub or a bar, be it travelling alone in public transport. But overwhelmingly, 69% of you have quite rightly stated that home is the most unsafest place for a woman. Now, many of us today will be signing in to this session from home, but for many, it will be the most dangerous place for them to be. So when we look at the facts around that, like I said, we know that home is the most unsafe place. We also know that particularly during lockdown, and certainly in the early days of complete lockdown, that we saw an increase in cases around domestic abuse. We know statistically that 3 in 5 women are killed worldwide as a result of domestic abuse by their partners or family members. Almost over a third of women worldwide will suffer domestic abuse or some form of abuse in their lifetime. And when we look at the figures globally, that women aged between 19 and 44 are at more risk of death due to domestic abuse than they are from those risks posed by war, cancer, and fatal car accidents combined. It really, really does highlight to us that the seriousness of these issues need to be addressed. So when we look at these figures in a bit more detail and further statistics, what we can see is that it disproportionately affects women. We know particularly around the issues, for example, around FGM, that at least 200 million women and girls globally have undergone female genital mutilation in over 30 countries where that data has been made available. We're also really, really quite keen to highlight that when it comes to the international aspect of crime, particularly around trafficking, that at least 72% of all trafficking victims are gendered towards women and girls. And particularly when that crosses various jurisdictions, it really reflects the issues that we have within policing to address these concerns. So this session is about harmful practices, but what we also need to do is look at domestic abuse. Why? Because quite often these harmful practices will come to the police's attention under the umbrella of domestic abuse. And so the Metropolitan Police's definition is quite broad, with respects of it being any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over, who have or are being in an intimate being intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender and sexuality. Now, we know that this encompasses different types of abuse, and quite often it's more than one form of abuse that will be experienced. So when we look at the different types of abuse, we recognise the physical violence, because that's quite often comes to our attention through the visibility of the harm that's taken place, but also it can include other harms such as sexual abuse and coercive controlling behaviour, which can quite often be very difficult to recognise and even harder quite often to prosecute. What we've certainly seen over the pandemic is an increase in financial abuse. The impact that this COVID-19 has had on women particularly has led towards being made redundant and losing their jobs, having to work from home. So all these issues have galvanised themselves towards increasing these risks to others. So I guess at this point, why should I care? Why should anybody care? Well, we know that where there's an estimated 1.6 million women who will experience domestic abuse just in the last year alone, we recognise that the impact that has is that at least 2 women every week in the UK are murdered due to domestic abuse. We also know that at least 12 to 15 killings each year take place under the name of so-called honour-based abuse. The cost to our economy is estimated at over 66 billion. And whilst we know that the risk for those living with higher risk of domestic abuse can take place over 2 to 3 years before they seek help, we also know that when it comes to honour-based abuse, where there is a high risk, that quite often can extend that period to at least 5 years. So whilst we can see that these figures are quite damning, and we recognise that the impact it has on victims also affects the way we police and the way we work as a society. One thing that is really important to mention is that rather than people asking, why doesn't she just leave? It would be more appropriate to ask, well, why is he being so abusive and what else is going on? Because again, as I mentioned, quite often there is more than what meets the eye when it comes to these cases. And certainly it's never the victim's fault. And we live in a society where some communities actually adopt the approach of victim blaming. And that again is further entrenched within harmful practices. So looking at this from a policing context, I wanted to just highlight to you some of the figures with regards to what's going on in the UK and globally as well. So what we can see is very much that in the UK, the police receive a call around through the emergency services every 30 seconds. That is a damning figure when it comes to the fact that the resources available towards domestic abuse are skewed towards not reflecting the enormity of those figures. And again, you can see here that over 1 million domestic abuse crimes and non-crime incidents are reported to police forces across England and Wales just in the year ending 2019, which was a 24% increase. Again, these figures, and particularly the crime survey figures, which includes all crimes, not just those reported through the police, show that at least 2.4 million people aged between 16 and 74 have experienced domestic abuse in that same year ending March 2019. And the impact that has on policing, particularly around investigations around domestic abuse homicides, again, is evidenced in the figures of in the last point. But what we also saw during lockdown was an increase in domestic homicides. In fact, there's been at least 26 domestic homicides since lockdown, the oldest being 87 and the youngest being a 2-year-old who was killed alongside her 4-year-old daughter, 4-year-old sister and her mother. So again, the impact that these crimes have isn't just within one issue, it crosses across all borders. And again, the most important thing here is to recognise that since lockdown restrictions have been imposed, we are seeing an increase in these crimes. That's not just reflected in the reporting to police, but also to NGOs and charities at the front line, supporting those who are able to come forward. So what do we mean by harmful practices? Now, it means different things in different cultures, but ultimately it is the persistent forms of violence and behaviours that are grounded on the basis of discrimination, sex and gender and age. And again, I mentioned that it is particularly engendered towards women and girls, although some men and boys can also become victims. It's often perceived to be a cultural or traditional practice or a religious or superstition tradition. The reality is it's none of those things. It's the interpretation of religion or custom or behaviours that are often used in order to justify those harmful practices. And whilst it can take the form of physical violence and suffering, quite often the majority of these cases will involve a huge amount of psychological harm. And in certain communities and societies where it's been around for so long, it's almost considered accepted as part of cultural norms, and quite often they go unchallenged. So here are some examples of some of the harmful practices, many of which we will be covering today. And again, as I mentioned, many of these harmful practices are an international, they're a global issue, and they affect different communities in different ways. So and as I mentioned, quite often these harmful practices will come to the police's attention under the call of domestic abuse, but they include issues such as honour-based abuse, forced marriage, early child forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and faith-based child abuse, such as witchcraft, breast ironing, and possessions. So where do these harmful practices come from? Where do they emerge? Well, underlying all of these harmful practices is the issue around gender inequality. And as you can see, as you can see, it's quite often an underlying societal issue around the empowerment or the, bear with me, the issues around sexes and the prevalence of patriarchy and male privilege. So let's have a quick look, first of all, at honour-based abuse. Now, this is a phrase that is often questioned and debated because there is no honour in honour-based abuse. And honour means different things to different people in different communities. It can take the form of several words such as izzat, sharm, and of course honour as well. And so therefore, when somebody refers to something as being honourable, we believe that to be something of high esteem and with great respect. But quite often, honour is very much seated within the issues around issues around the perception of families and the behaviour of quite often a female. It's unwritten codes and practices that are enforced on the female family members to uphold the family name and the family honour. And any perceived breaches of those unwritten codes can often result in physical and psychological violence. So as we can see here, it's defined as a collection of practices that are used to control the behaviour within families in order to protect perceived cultural or religious beliefs and or honour. And again, this cuts across all communities, nationalities and faiths. And we see that particularly with the work that we do at the Sharon Project, that it is very heavily male dominated. The other thing around honour-based abuse that we need to remember is that unlike domestic abuse, honour-based abuse can include multiple perpetrators, and they will be highly motivated and quite often protected within the families and also within the communities, making it difficult to identify. Boys and girls married under the age of 18 by the time we finish this session. So it's a global issue, and you see from the pictures here that these are actually pictures of two girls who were actually rescued by UNICEF. One being aged 10, who was married to that young man, that older man who was at least 10 years her senior, and the other one who was aged 12. So when we look at forced marriage as well, we also need to recognise that the legal definition of a forced marriage to be very much that it is a marriage where one or both parties do not consent to the marriage and where force or duress has been used. But also in the cases of those with learning disabilities where there is no capacity to consent, that it has to be recognised as a forced marriage. Now, this was very much legislated in the UK in 2014 and holds a 7-year prison sentence with a 5-year sentence for any breach of a forced marriage protection order. Now, when we look at these issues, when we look at forced marriages, we also need to address that arranged marriages are very different. In that respect, what we need to recognise is that within an arranged marriage, families or other members may take a role in introducing someone to a match, but it's up to both parties to choose to consent. And it's this choice that makes it very different to a forced marriage. And in doing so, we need to recognise that arranged marriages are acceptable because of that choice. So when we do look at arranged marriages, we can also recognise that in an historical context, they have been in existence for generations and were very popular, particularly amongst the upper classes, by way of gaining wealth and status. Shakespeare talks about arranged marriages, particularly through Taming of the Shrew and Romeo and Juliet. So it isn't a concept unknown to us. But again, it's about having that choice to consent. Looking at the figures in the UK, this next slide reflects the forced marriage unit statistics that show the most recent figures around forced marriages that were reported in 2019. Now, for those of you who may not know, the forced marriage unit is a team that was established many years ago as part of the Home Office and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to provide domestic and consulate support for those who've been affected by forced marriages. So again, we're seeing a very gendered approach here, where 80% of those who reported were female victims. We also see that at least 15% were under the age of 15, and that around almost half were aged 16 to 25, very young demographic. So this is certainly an area that as an organisation we see coming forward as being highly at risk. We also recognise that those with special characteristics such as LGBT and learning disabilities are also affected by forced marriages. And whilst London has the highest reporting rates in the UK at 22%, it's very shortly followed by the East and West Midlands and also the North West. And again, it's really important to recognise that whilst it is not specific to one country or culture, since 2011, the Forced Marriage Unit has been dealing with cases over 110 countries so far. So why would somebody choose to put their child through a forced marriage? What are the motivations? Well, quite often we express this through cultural or religious traditions, or in order to control unwanted sexuality or behaviours that are seen as being too westernised, and as a means of punishment or to uphold the honour of the family, protecting their status. Ultimately, regardless of the reasoning behind the motives behind that, a forced marriage, it is a criminal offence, and it's quite often the start of a lifetime of abuse. And again, when we look at the economic status as being a motivation, such as dowry, which we will talk about shortly, it also has a financial gain. And what we've seen, particularly over the last few months around refugee camps, is families who believe that by providing their child, their children, their girls to another family, they're providing some level of protection because they're unable to support them during this period. But again, there would quite often be a financial gain within that. And equally, as I mentioned before, that when it comes to harmful practices, they are interlinked, and it is a global and a local issue. So I mentioned briefly dowry, and I wanted to go into this because this is an area that we've been working on for many years, and it comes across in many of the cases that we deal with. So when we talk about dowry, what we mean is that it's quite often part of the ceremonies around certain marriages. It's quite often the transfer of money or goods or an estate that a woman brings to her husband or his family within that marriage. It has different names in different communities and different cultures, but ultimately it is the price, if you like, of marrying into a different family. Now, this historically was determined to provide security for the bride, that should anything go wrong in that marriage, that she would have financial means in which to survive. Over the years, clearly this has been turned into a form of abuse and also financial gain. So when we look at what happens within dowry-related abuse, we quite often see it as acts of violence, but also coercion. Quite often, if a bride enters a new home, i.e. she's moved into her husband's house, and quite often it's a multi-generational household, if she is viewed as not having enough dowry or not bringing enough money into the household, then she can quite often be viewed as a cheap bride, and as a result can experience physical violence, rape, attacks, and again, financial abuse. So how prevalent is dowry abuse in the UK? Well, we don't currently record any figures on this, and it's very much reliant on the victim making disclosures. And whilst it's not currently a crime in the UK, we are seeing other crimes being committed as a result of dowry-related abuse, such as assault, theft, harassment, and threats. And one of the biggest issues that we see is the use of threats around immigration for those who are coming to the UK on a spousal visa. And it's become such a huge issue that what we've now had to do is look at a policing response to addressing dowry. So in many of the conferences that we've done, particularly national police conferences, when we've spoken about dowry, when we've had survivors speak about their stories, one of the officers in the actual conference went away and came back with a response, which I'll share with you now. So in looking at the fact that there isn't an exact legislation around dowry itself, the concept has been around since at least the 1800s. And so what we can see is that there can be a police response with regards to addressing these issues in order to ensure that the aggrieved party is able to evidence that that property belongs to her. And it's done in a way that adapts the existing legislation that we currently have. So whenever we see a problem, we try to seek a solution. And I think that can equally be very important. So again, looking at harmful practices through the lens of the impact it can have is very much around similar to domestic abuse, but can include an increase in isolation from family and friends. It can also, as I mentioned earlier, have threats around immigration status and fear of being deported. It can also be that many people who are affected by these harmful practices are unable to come forward for fear of bringing shame or being disowned by their families. And again, it's the repeated physical and emotional and sexual abuse. And quite often, the sexual abuse can lead to forced pregnancies. Now, we know that the impact is long lasting. The work that we do is to provide that long-term support provision for those who have been affected by harmful practices. In many cases, it can last, the impact could be for a lifetime and quite often need additional support. And again, it's about the fear of going forward. One thing when it comes to harmful practices that I would like to say is that quite often professionals fear potentially of coming forward and addressing these issues because of fear of perhaps being politically incorrect. Well, actually, the perpetrators of these particular crimes are relying on you to be afraid to come forward and afraid to speak out and address these issues, because the more that they're able to say, it's inappropriate for you to talk about these issues, it's a cultural issue, it's a traditional issue, the more they're able to say that, the less likely you are to go forward and the more likely they are to continue to perpetuate these crimes. So again, when we look at harmful practices, what we also need to do is look at what the crime types are, what is going on. If you're only looking at a forced marriage, you may miss all the other things that will be existing alongside these crimes. And this can include some of the issues that we've raised here, but what we call this is the A to Z of crimes, to always ask the and question, and what else is going on, and who else is involved, and who else might be at risk, and what else can we do in order to safeguard and protect. So this next slide really looks at the international legislation timeline regarding gender-based abuse. And you can see from as far back as 1946 to date, there has been a lot of work done with regards to addressing the issue of gender inequality being the basis for a lot of the crimes and abuses that particularly women experience. So certainly having more of an awareness of these issues is really important, but this legislation and this timeline is great, but what more do we need to do in order to ensure we're seeing a move towards eradicating violence against women and girls? And you could argue that many of these treaties and conventions are great on paper, but the reality is that they're only as effective as the communities and the countries that apply them to their societies and their policing. Here back in the UK, we have seen a huge amount of legislation when it comes to addressing violence against women and girls. From 2003, we had the Female Genital Mutilation Act, right up to date where we have the Domestic Abuse Act, which we are hoping will receive its royal assent by the end of this year, which will be the first time in the UK that domestic abuse will be viewed as a criminal act in itself and provide support for victims. What it will also do is recognise children are also to be victims of domestic abuse. Again, changing that narrative from 16 to much younger. But with all this legislation, how effective has it been? Have we seen an influx of cases that on conviction rates on the grounds of legislation? Well, we know that legislation in itself isn't enough to deter crime, but what we have seen is the first ever forced marriage, FGM conviction in the UK, which took place last year. Now, FGM being a very private and very delicate situation to address, particularly where the victim is quite often a minor under the age of 18 and quite often very under the age of 5. In this particular case, a woman was jailed for 11 years for performing FGM on her own child within the home. One of the things that we have also seen through lockdown is a serious concern from professionals, health professionals particularly, around the fear that FGM is being undertaken behind closed doors. And the access to the health professionals is hindered more so because of the restrictions. So we recognise that although this has been the first conviction on FGM in the UK, there have been other cases that have just fallen short of the conviction level that is required of such a crime. And again, with forced marriages, we've had 3 convictions in the UK. The first being in Wales, and then another in the West Midlands, and then again in Leeds. Now, again, you might ask yourself, why so few convictions when we have legislation, we have awareness of these issues? Well, quite often, the victim of a forced marriage, quite often the female, doesn't want to criminalise her family. She doesn't want to go through the court system. Quite often, all they want is for the crime to stop, the abuse to stop, to be safe. So the role of the police within forced marriage context quite often takes the role of safeguarding, of protecting that individual. And prosecution can quite often come secondary to that. When we do get a conviction around forced marriage, what it does do is it sends a very clear message that the highest level of sentencing will be applied to those crimes, because the need for the deterrent of that occurring. So at this point, I'm going to go back to you guys and ask, what do we know? So in this particular session, I'm just going to ask a few questions, and there's multiple choice, and please do use the chat to add in your comments. Oops, bear with me, I don't have that slide. So I'm going to improvise here and ask you some questions with regards to what do we know. So I guess the first question I want to ask is, in the chat, if you're able to, can you just add what you think are harmful practices? What would constitute a harmful practice? So I can see FGM, yes, that's absolutely one of the harmful practices that we've covered. And I just wonder if, yes, and also forced marriage. Okay. So yes, there are several types of harmful practices that we've covered today, but actually there are so many more that we just don't have the time to address. So at this point, I believe it's now almost 9:30. I wonder if before we go on to the case study, if there have been any questions at this stage.
Yeah, Polly, there's a couple of points that you may want to come back to. One of the biggest issues faced regarding police response to many of these issues is the lack of cultural awareness in the police. And this consequently often leaves the victim feeling supported, is the first point. And the next linked point is that the recruitment from various communities in the police service is a step in the right direction, as cultural awareness training has brought little change over the years. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think both of those points are really important, because when it comes to the recruitment of your workforce, you want it to be as diverse and relevant to the communities that you serve. And certainly we have seen a lack of cultural awareness training over the years. At the same time, what we also see is the need, the demand, if you like, or the will to learn more about these issues. So, for example, within the London Harmful Practices Working Group within the Met Police, we very much are our foundations very much around the cultural awareness training that is required at all levels in order to better be able to tackle these issues. And remember what I said around perpetrators wanting you to feel awkward, wanting you to feel that perhaps you're seen as racist or insensitive in order for them to continue. The reality is, the serious fact is that it's the survivor, it's the victim who wants you to use your professional curiosity to ask those questions as to why these things are happening, to challenge certain norms in order to really find out what's going on. I certainly think there is more need for cultural awareness, but also harmful practices from a policing perspective can often come secondary to, for example, crisis and education and other areas of policing, but they are happening right now in plain sight. And if we don't have the cultural awareness or the professional curiosity in order to address these issues, they'll all continue to go unchecked, and therefore we will see an increase in even more victims and survivors coming forward.
Thank you, Polly. Vicky's raised her hand, so if we can just invite Vicky to speak. Vicky, if you just unmute your mic and then make the point you want to make.
Hi, Polly. Do you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
No. Yes. Just maybe my point was about making it, if not clear, but to make people aware that even though we have these sometimes biases about certain cultures or certain backgrounds where this happens, that we really need to keep our eyes open and our minds open. The fact that harmful practices are present in every culture. It's just that maybe we have not been critical enough to see that they are here, and we keep on looking at the others, and we need to revise what's going on with our own cultures. And me being a Latin American, I have been confronted many times by people asking me, why are you so worried about harmful practices if this is not part of your culture? And yes, indeed, as a Latin American, I can see that it happens in many of our different contexts, and I guess that it should happen in many other places. So I guess that this is the fact. We have to be more critical and look around us and keep an eye open to understand that it happens everywhere, just like a comment.
Right. Thank you, Vicky. And you're quite right. It is an issue that affects all cultures. And again, if you only look at harmful practices through one lens, then you're going to miss everything else that's going on. The media also have a big role to play. Quite often, for example, FGM is seen as an issue that happens in Africa, and that forced marriages is just a South Asian issue. The reality is so different. You have cases of FGM across all cultures and communities in other continents, and even in India, and forced marriages taking place in all communities and cultures, including within Europe. So we know that these issues are engendered around the issue around the female and about subjugation and control of their bodies and their behaviours, which is an issue that's endemic across all cultures and communities. So you're quite right, we do need to be looking much broader than the stereotype or the media image that we may get, in order to better support the whole of our community and not just part of it. So thank you for that, Vicky. That's really useful. And I know some of the work that you're doing currently is around providing those safe spaces for women to come forward, and is about retraining communities to better understand and recognise the signs of domestic abuse and harmful practices. So again, there is work being done currently to address these issues, but we can't do it on our own. What we need is for everyone to play their part, and part of that is certainly recognising that these harmful practices are happening in our communities right now. Thank you. Karen, is there another question?
There's a question and an interesting point. Have you got time for both?
We do, yes.
Okay, so Ian makes the point from his experience as a police officer about suspects challenging officers' political correctness that you referred to previously. And his experience is that they hope you will, as a police officer, not continue that line of inquiry in the hope that you will fear being perceived as a racist or at least culturally unaware. So try and put you off your kilter, in effect. Do you want to just respond to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we see policing move over the years towards being more progressive, certainly in recognising race. We've only got to look at, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement to recognise that these are issues that we can't continue to ignore. And by addressing them, it doesn't make it make you less politically correct or inappropriate. What it does is it allows us to recognise that the professional curiosity that potentially led you to being a police officer in the first place is very much still alive. And I would certainly say that for everybody who potentially has been accused of or fear being placed in a position, that you need to use that curiosity, because it's not about how uncomfortable you might feel for that few moments on calling out an issue. Think about the victim there. Think about the fact that that victim is depending and relying on you to call it out because they perhaps don't have that voice to do so themselves. So certainly we can see that more needs to be done, but also I need to also recognise that we have come a long way in addressing many of these issues within policing. But of course, we welcome more as we go along.
Yeah, Ian just goes on to make the point that looking at early training, we should ensure that attachments are mandatory to service providers that look after victims of harmful practice, so that all new staff understand the situation and thus have more confidence when dealing with those situations. There's just one question or one comment. Let me just go back. Here we are. So Johnny just makes the point, what will be interesting is finding out the number of staff in the forced marriage unit and human trafficking units from BAME backgrounds.
Okay, I can certainly speak for within context of the forced marriage unit because we work very closely. It is a very diverse team who work within that. And again, as mentioned before, it's a partnership between members from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and also the Home Office. And they, like I mentioned before, they've been around since at least 2011. And the team is very much diverse, with either lived or not knowledgeable experience of many different cultures. So it's certainly reflected within that. And the casework that they do is on two levels. One is about supporting anyone in the UK who's been affected by a forced marriage or is at risk of a forced marriage. And the second is where there is a British national that is taken overseas for the purposes of a forced marriage, where it's feasible to do so, they will develop a rescue or repatriation of that British national back to the UK, which can have many challenges in itself, because on the international level there are different procedures and policies and risks involved in doing so. But they very much are instilled with regards to the support of all citizens within the UK. So I would certainly say the diversity is there. But it is interesting when you look at other areas of support and departments, the reality is quite often the issues being addressed aren't necessarily reflected in the diversity of those groups. But in that instance, certainly we can say that with absolute confidence.
Okay, have you got time for one more?
Yeah, just one more before we take a short break.
Lovely. So this is from Regina, and it sounds simple. I fear the answer may be more complex. Are there any rules if a person's forced to get married back home, so out of the UK, to someone much, much older, just for the purpose of enabling that other person to come back to the UK?
Yes, we see that quite often. Now, the statistics that I showed you on the forced marriage unit from last year are quite telling, but what it didn't tell you is that only 5% of forced marriages took place in the UK out of those figures. All the rest were overseas forced marriages. And what we do see is that the journey that many of these victims face is to be taken abroad for the purpose of marriage. And we've got to remember that forced marriage legislation extends our jurisdiction to say that if somebody is taken abroad, that legislation still applies. And so when somebody is taken abroad, quite often it is to marry somebody, sometimes it's a family member or a complete stranger. When we look at the motivations behind why that person's been forced to marriage, it helps us to work out what other crimes have potentially taken place. For those who are taken abroad and forced into a marriage, quite often they'll have their passports taken away or ripped up. They will have their mobile phones taken away, so they're isolated and they've no means of contacting anybody. And sometimes they will be left there in order to ensure that that person becomes pregnant, and only then allowed to return to the UK in order to make applications for a spousal visa to be applied to that person. And I've just seen in the comment that yes, quite often a motivating factor is money. Again, the reason for these forced marriages can be to secure family ties. It can be to bring other family members to the UK on an immigration level. But whatever the reason is, quite often it does mean that somebody will start a lifetime of abuse because they didn't have the choice. They didn't decide to enter that marriage. Does that help?
I'm sure it did. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so at this point, I wonder if we want to take a very brief break. It's now just coming up to 10 to 10. So I wonder if we take a short break till 10 o'clock or just before, and we come back. When we do come back, what we wanted to do next is look at a case study that will reflect all of what we've currently covered on a case that many of you already know, and there were some materials in the materials box for you to review. So if we take a break now, Karen, would that be okay? And then we'll come back just before 10.
10 minutes. Yep, 10 minutes, absolutely perfect. 10 o'clock return.
Perfect. Great. Hello everyone and welcome back. I hope you had a good break. Now what we mentioned earlier is that what we're next going to do for the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour, is to go through a case study and ask some questions around what happened in this situation and what could have been improved. Bear with me. Hi, just checking. Can everybody hear me? If somebody could just pop something in the chat just to confirm that the stream is going forward.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Right. So, like I said, the next part of this session is going to be around looking at a case study. And so what I'm going to do right now is share my slides with you. And it will be a case that some of you will be familiar with. And this is the case of Banaz Mahmood. Now, this is a particularly significant case because it really reshaped the way the policing response has been towards honour-based abuse. And when she said, "Now that I've given my statement, what can you do for me?" it really highlighted the failings and the need to really understand harmful practices. So this is actually taken from one of the interviews that she provided to the police as a result of her situation. So let's look at what happened. So Banaz was 10 years old when she arrived in the UK with her family, fleeing from Saddam's regime in Iraq. At the age of 17, her parents had what they would class as an arranged marriage for her to marry someone much older than her, even though she didn't want to. And within months, this marriage became very violent towards Banaz. So much so that she was regularly hospitalized as a result of the sexual violence that she experienced from her husband. Every time she told her parents that she wanted to leave him, they would suggest that she goes back to him and that he was, in their eyes, the David Beckham of son-in-laws. So it was very difficult for Banaz to leave that marriage, but eventually she did, and she filed for a divorce. And when she did file for a divorce, a few months later, she met someone and she entered into a relationship. And it was when she was spotted outside a tube station in London, kissing her partner farewell, that she was spotted by members of the community, who then reported her actions and her behaviour to her family. Within moments, she was confined by her family. She was beaten and forbidden from seeing her boyfriend. And all this time, what was very evident was that it wasn't just about Banaz, it was about the wider community's involvement in her situation. She did manage to escape, and she did try to seek police. In fact, seek support. In fact, she contacted the police at least 5 times, stating that she was in danger and that she feared for her life. She even wrote a letter to the police stating that if anything happens to her, then her father should be investigated. While she was being confined by her family, it was made very clear that from the moment she was spotted in a public display of affection, that within 24 hours, the family had not only been notified, but male family members had colluded together, got together and decided that Banaz had brought shame, and so had her partner, and therefore they needed to be removed. And when we say removed, we mean they had planned to suggest that she was to die. So as I mentioned, she had contacted the police on 5 occasions. That she even made a list and named all the people that she suspected, because she overheard on a phone call, who had been scheduled to kill her, and still nothing was done. In January of 2016, she was murdered by a plot that involved her father, her uncle, male cousins, and other members of the community. They not only raped and strangled her, they then put her body in a suitcase, drove it over 100 miles away, and buried it. Now, it only came to the police's attention when Detective Chief Inspector Caroline Good of the Metropolitan Police was investigating Banaz as a missing person. It was only then that she uncovered the evidence of failings from various different interventions within the police, that this was something more than a missing person situation. In fact, her family hadn't actually reported her missing, and that quite alarmed Caroline as well, that why would they not want to report their daughter missing? So this ensued years of building a case, gathering evidence, and it was peppered throughout by the silence that she was met from the family members and also from the community. So in the process of the investigation, the police were not only able to bring to justice the killers of Banaz, but where two of those perpetrators had fled overseas, she was able to apply for an extradition order, and it was the first extradition order from Britain to Iraq. And what that did was it really highlighted particularly that particular officer, but the wider team involved as well, on how deep-seated honor-based abuse can be, and how the challenges faced by the police were often overtaken by the silence of the community, because they believed that what they were doing by, for example, providing alibis or giving misinformation to the police, that they were somehow holding a badge of honor, because what Banaz had done in their eyes was so outrageous that the only response and the only outcome would have been to remove her. And as I mentioned, it has shaped the way training and the police's response has been across all the forces. But unfortunately, Banaz's case isn't the only one. And unless more lessons are learnt, unfortunately, we will potentially see further cases. So just looking at the timeline of this particular situation and Banaz's case, we know that when she was a child, and certainly up to the age of 16, 17, where she was forced to marry, that she would have come to the attention of various services. She was regularly hospitalised. There would have been calls out around domestic abuse around that time as well, but that had been ignored. And again, her only crime was to fall in love. And all she wanted was to be with someone that was not abusive, that genuinely cared for her. But her entire family and the community decided that couldn't be the case, that she couldn't choose her own path. And in October of 2005, when she first reported to the police that she feared for her life, an interview was undertaken, but no further action was followed up. And it was in New Year's Eve that her father took her to her grandmother's house whilst the grandmother wasn't there, and plied her with alcohol to stupefy her. And as she stood under her father's instructions facing forward, she could see from the reflection on the TV screen that he was coming towards her with a rope and in order to strangle her. She managed to escape, and in doing so she cut herself by breaking through a window. And ensuring that, sorry, bear with me. Yeah, so hopefully you can see that the timeline there now. And quite rightly, what we saw was that there was a series of events that could have been prevented. And again, when she was at her grandmother's house and she managed to escape, what she did manage to do was fall into a cafe and call for the police. The police did arrive, and they saw her screaming that my father's just tried to kill me, and believed that she was she was attention seeking, and that she was making it up In fact, the police officer who arrived at this scene even suggested that they arrest Banaz for criminal damage. She was eventually taken to hospital, where she did make a video entry to explain what happened. And again, no further action was taken. Once she was released from hospital, herself and her partner did attend the police station one final time in order to make separate statements that their lives were at risk. And the officer that she spoke to had suggested at that point perhaps that she needed to leave and that they could get her into a safe place. Banaz's response was what we generally would expect, that she wanted to stay with her mother for one more night before she was to decide to leave the family home. It was a few days later that it was established that Banaz had been brutally raped and murdered, and her body stuffed in a suitcase and taken to Birmingham. And this is where the investigation really took force, because the police had to use all the powers that they had within their resources in order to really establish what was going on. And you've got to remember, at this point, there was no body. They had to find a body, but they had to undertake the investigation of a murder inquiry. So when we look at this particular case and we look at what the police's responses were, we see that what powers they had in around the legislation. We see that they applied the international jurisdiction that they had with regards to the extradition order. What they also recognised is that there were multiple perpetrators and multiple defendants, and they were all very much highly motivated and very well protected. But it wasn't just Banaz and her partner who were the victims in this. There were multiple other witnesses that required protection and safeguarding. And again, we call into question around the community intelligence. We know that community intelligence is key in order to best understand what's going on with regards to harmful practices. But in this particular instance, there were at least 80 people within the community who came forward to give false information to put the police off the trail as to continuing with their investigation. There was also a level of covert surveillance that took place in this particular case, whereby one of the perpetrators who had been placed in remand would call using the phone within the prison to boast about what he had done, to boast about how we could see the last breaths leaving her body. And it was this covert surveillance that also secured the conviction. In 2015, we recognised that Her Majesty's Inspectorate Constabulary did an investigation and inspection of all the UK police forces around how many forces were ready, fit for purpose when dealing with forced marriage and honour-based abuse, and only 3 actually passed. And the recommendations from that particular inspection remain outstanding, and it is suggested that a further inspection is required across all police forces to ensure that they are fit for purpose and ready and able to deal with these types of crimes. But one of the things that really came through on this particular case with Banaz is something that we call the one chance rule. You may only have one chance to support that person, one chance for that person to be able to safely disclose what's going on and for you to act appropriately. And if we don't take that one chance rule, what we may see is further cases such as Banaz continuing to occur. So at that point, I just wanted to highlight that many of the cases that I deal with, particularly around honour-based abuse, are those survivors who have managed to leave at the point of potentially being harmed and murdered. And it's that long-term support that victims quite often need outside the scope of any investigation or criminal engagement. And so I guess one of the things that we find very challenging, and certainly over we've seen over COVID and the pandemic, is an increase in high risk, high harm cases. We're talking about particular cases around honour-based abuse where the crimes that are taking place are so severe, from serious aggravated assault right up to conspiracy to murder. So these are crimes that are taking place right now. They are issues that we all need to deal with, and particularly having an appropriate police response towards these harmful practices is needed even more now than it was before. So I hope that gives you all a flavour as to the kind of issues that we deal with when it comes to harmful practices, particularly honour-based crimes. And I just wonder if there are any questions or any comments that you would like to make, particularly on this case, but also in respect of other areas that have been covered in this presentation right now. And if you could either unmute and ask your question or pop your question in the chat, I'm sure we can facilitate it from there. Okay, that's great. So one of the things that I often need to respond to is, what can we do with regards to this? What can we do with regards to addressing these harmful practices within and having an appropriate policing response? And I think many of you on this call in this session today will recognise that part of that solution is partnership working. If the police had worked with the NGOs at the time to better understand what honour-based abuse was and the impact it could have, and that it isn't linear and it doesn't cut across a straight line. In fact, it can be quite, the level of risk can fluctuate at any given point. And so the risk that is being managed needs to be concurrent to the circumstances that is being established every time. So partnership working is definitely something that I would absolutely say is key to addressing these issues. It's not just a police issue, it's not just the police who potentially had failed in Banaz's case, but what happened to the community? Where was her family? Where was social services and other statutory services and non-statutory services? What we've really got to do is wake up and shake up the system to ensure that where we can support others with regards to harmful practices, that we need to work together. So I certainly think that partnership working is key. And I apologise for the spell check on Banaz's name. It's something that I'm very particular about, and I'm very embarrassed that it's spelled incorrectly on my slides. So thank you for pointing that out. And I guess before we go, I just wanted to check if there are any further questions that anyone would like to say, or any comments. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for that. We do have a few more minutes, and I'm happy to stay on the call for those who might want to have ask any further questions. Other than that, what I would like to also just do right now is just go through towards highlighting what the second session for tomorrow will be covering. So for tomorrow's session, we will be looking at the policing response and how COVID-19 has reshaped policing response to harmful practices. What we'll also be looking at is the impact on community safety and security. And we will also be touching on perpetrator profiling models, particularly looking around these harmful practices and what tools are available for the police, particularly in order to deal with these issues, and further considerations that need to be applied. So I do hope that as many of you as possible are able to join me again tomorrow when we'll be reviewing the policing response. And just before I go, I just wanted to highlight that we do have an ask, if you like, and that is that for those who wish to, we would like to get your viewpoints to draw on your expertise and experiences around evaluating what you perceive around harmful practices and what recommendations could be made with regards to addressing this from a policing perspective. So if you would like to, it would be great for you to have a written paper that you can submit with regards to the issues that are listed here. And what we would also do is ensure that this information is shared with you either in the materials in this chat or certainly after this call as well. So we would welcome your papers on this with regards to pulling some of those resources together and then potentially publishing or showcasing some of those concepts within the next conference in December. So it just leaves me to say thank you again for your time and your patience, and apologies for a few tech issues. However, hopefully by tomorrow everything will be back up, and I hopefully will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you all again, and have a great day. Cheers.